A medicine carrier hangs over a dark rift while the bridge beneath it twists out of line. One engineer has seconds to choose which part of the structure to sacrifice first. Thank you for watching and supporting the channel. Take a breath, stay close, and enter the story. The first medicine carrier was already rolling toward narrow span on Atreya when Nolan Hartwell of the Terran Reconstruction Corps stepped out of the transport lift. He stopped with one boot on the landing grid and stared at the bridge. The upper deck crossed the narrow rift in a long silver line, but there was nothing graceful about it up close. Whole sections of plating had been replaced with mismatched alloys. Old blast scars ran across the support ribs. Temporary braces hung beneath the center span like broken bones held together by straps. The deck vibrated under the weight of 3 loaded vehicles, and the vibration was not steady. Nolan dropped his equipment case, pressed 2 fingers to the rail, and felt the rhythm through the metal. Too fast. Uneven. Getting worse. "Stop that convoy," he said. The nearest officer turned toward him. She was tall, broad-shouldered, and armored in dark field gear that had been repaired often enough to show its age. Thin bands of pale light traced the sides of her neck and vanished beneath her collar. Her eyes were fixed on the lead carrier, not on Nolan. "You're Nolan Hartwell," she said, "and that is a bridge trying to become several smaller bridges. I'm Ivara Tesh. The medicine crosses now." Nolan glanced at the 3 carriers. The first held sealed medical containers. The second carried coolant packs for a surgical wing. The third was loaded with portable life support units. Beyond them, people crowded behind a barrier on the Sarah Reach side of the span. Far across the rift, the lights of Torren Basin shone through rising dust. He opened his scanner. One stabilizer was reporting late. A second was drifting out of phase. The center span was carrying more torsion than the project file had promised. "Close the bridge," he repeated. "I need a full load survey. The hospital has less than 6 hours of reserve medicine." "Then somebody should have called me 6 hours earlier." "They did. Your transport was delayed by a solar interference warning your people labeled moderate. It was moderate when the warning was sent." The deck gave another low shudder. Nolan looked at the lead carrier, then at the crowd, then at Ivara. "How much of that cargo is essential?" "All of it." That answer is beloved by logistics officers and useless to engineers. A woman in a medical vest approached at a run. "I'm Mira Solt. I packed the convoy. The medicine and coolant stay. 2 of the portable units can wait." Nolan pointed at her. "You I like." Ivara's expression did not move. "She is not asking for your approval." "No, but she gave me a useful answer." "That is a strong opening." He knelt, pulled a portable strain reader from his case, and clipped it to the rail. The numbers jumped. He checked the carrier weights, then looked toward the far end of the span, where a power station fed the bridge's stabilizers. "Each vehicle crosses alone," he said. "Minimum speed. No sudden braking. Leave 50 yards between them. The second carrier shifts its coolant packs to the left side. The third stays here." Ivara studied him. "You said the bridge must close." "It should. It will not. So now we are discussing the least dangerous bad decision." "That is the first sensible thing you have said." Nolan looked at her. "You may be the reason this contract came with hazard pay." "It did not." "Then I have already found the first act of sabotage." Ivara gave the signal. The crowd moved back. Mira climbed into the lead carrier. Nolan walked beside it as it rolled onto narrow span. The bridge's stabilizers were not anti-gravity devices, despite the name. They shifted part of the load through electromagnetic fields into anchor piles driven deep below the rift. When both ends supplied power in phase, the system eased stress across the central span. When the phases drifted, the fields pushed and pulled at different moments. At best, that caused vibration. At worst, it tore the bridge apart one joint at a time. The lead carrier reached the center. A warning light flashed on Nolan's scanner. The stabilizer beneath the north service rail dropped to 0. The deck twisted. The carrier slid sideways. Mira fought the steering, but the right wheel struck the rail and tore through it. Beneath the road surface, a maintenance platform ripped free, swinging down on 2 cables. The carrier followed until its front half hung over the rift. The second vehicle braked hard. "Do not move," Nolan shouted. The order cracked across the deck. Drivers froze. Ivara was already running toward the lead carrier. Nolan threw open the rear hatch of a construction lifter parked beside the entry platform and climbed into the controls. The machine was built for moving beams, not saving bridges, but it had a reinforced arm and a mechanical clamp. He drove it onto the span, watching the strain readings leap. "Back the second carrier 3 feet, he called. Slowly, Ivara relayed the order. The driver eased backward. The bridge rolled beneath them. "Stop." Nolan lowered the lifter arm against a twisting support rib and locked the clamp. Metal groaned as the machine took part of the load. Ivara reached the hanging carrier. She clipped a line to the broken rail and climbed onto the vehicle's side. "Driver is injured," she said through the comm. "Can you move him?" "Not while the cabin is angled like this." "Good news. The angle is getting worse." "You call that good news?" "No, I'm trying optimism. It feels dishonest." Nolan crawled from the lifter with a coil of mechanical cable over one shoulder. Electric discharge flickered along the rail. Remote equipment would fail if the interference rose again. He clipped himself to the deck, lowered onto the broken maintenance frame, and moved toward the anchor housing beneath the carrier. The stabilizer could be restarted manually. If he restored the field, it might level the deck enough for Ivara to pull the driver free. He opened the housing. A compact, explosive device sat across the reset bus. Nolan stopped. The device was old in appearance, but the contacts were clean. It had been wired to trigger when a technician followed the standard Terran restoration sequence. Someone had expected him, or at least someone trained like him. "Ivara," he said, "do not let anyone cycle power." "Why?" "Because the bridge has opinions." That answer is not sufficient. There's a mine on the reset circuit. Silence lasted half a second. Then her voice became colder. "Can you remove it?" "Eventually." "We do not have eventually." Nolan looked at the hanging maintenance frame. One section was pulling the carrier downward. If he released it, the carrier would rise slightly, but the frame would fall into the rift. He traced the explosive wiring. It was linked to the main anchor clamp. Cutting the wrong lead would blow the support point holding the vehicle. "Can you get the driver out if the cabin rises 1 foot?" he asked. "Yes." "Mira, move the medicine from the rear compartment into the second carrier. Start with the light cases." Mira crawled toward the back hatch. 2 workers clipped lines to the deck and began passing containers hand to hand. Nolan cut the maintenance platform's secondary cable. The frame dropped 6 inches and slammed against the remaining line. The carrier's cabin lifted. Ivara broke the side panel, reached inside, and pulled the driver toward her. The bridge bucked again. She locked one arm through the frame and held the injured man against her body until Mira reached them. "Driver clear," Ivara said. Nolan opened a manual bypass below the mine. It would isolate the stabilizer, but it would also remove power from the maintenance frame's final magnetic support. He checked the convoy positions. Second carrier, reverse another 4 feet. No faster than walking speed. The driver obeyed. Weight moved away from the damaged span. "Everyone off the lower platform," Nolan said. The workers climbed. Ivara came last, pushing the injured driver ahead of her. Nolan pulled the bypass. The remaining maintenance platform tore loose and vanished into the rift. The mine stayed silent. The sudden loss of weight let the lifter arm raise the carrier enough for its rear wheels to catch the deck. Nolan climbed back into the machine and pulled. The carrier scraped away from the edge. Only after all 3 vehicles were back on stable plating did he breathe. Mira checked the driver and declared the injury serious but manageable. The medicine had survived, though one coolant. Pack had split and coated the deck in silver frost. The maintenance platform was gone. The lifter's left actuator had burned out, and the center span now carried a fresh bend. The ruined actuator brought back Nolan's last project, the lost equipment, and the review that had nearly ended his career. He pushed the memory aside. Narrow span needed him in the present. Ivara stood beside Nolan while workers secured the area. "You disobey procedures quickly," she said. "I prefer to think of it as correcting a procedure that was trying to kill us. You knew what cutting that platform would do." I knew what I should do. That is not the same answer. It is the honest one. She looked toward the far end, where the medicine convoy finally resumed its crossing under strict spacing. You kept the route open, she said. You kept the driver alive. I was doing my duty. So was I. It is nice when those overlap. For the first time, something almost like amusement touched her face. It vanished before he could be sure. The mine did not. Nolan carried it into a sealed work bay after the convoy cleared. Kessador, the chief grid engineer from Sarah Reach, watched him remove the casing. Tuvin Mar stood on the other side of the table, arms folded. Nolan had been told Tuvin was a former combat engineer from Torn Basin. The two local engineers had not spoken directly since entering the bay. The outer shell bore an old Torn military mark. The trigger contacts came from Sarah Reach. The timing board was Terran. That board is from your core, Kessa said. From a supplier used by my core, Nolan corrected. The code is standard field restoration. So a Terran planted it. Or someone bought a manual. Tuvin leaned closer. The shell is too clean. Old devices from Torn Basin were sealed with resin. This was opened recently. Ivara entered carrying a data slate. The access log says I opened the lower service door 2 hours before Nolan arrived. Kessa took the slate. The solar interference may have shifted the record. It recorded my full command signature. Nolan looked at Ivara. Were you there? No. Can the bridge generate that signature from noise? No. Tuvin's. Gaze sharpened. Then someone copied it. Ivara looked at him. Do not make claims you cannot support. You asked what the evidence means. I asked what it proves. Nolan set down a tool. Right now, it proves 2 things. Someone wants us looking at old enemies, and someone knows enough about this bridge to make the evidence look tidy. Kessa crossed her arms. You want the route closed? Yes. Ivara's answer came at once. No. Nolan turned toward her. There's an active saboteur inside the structure. And if we close the span after a device marked with Torn symbols is found, Sarah Reach will say Torn Basin attacked the medicine convoy. Tuvin's jaw tightened. And Torn will say Sarah Reach built the trigger. Kessa looked at him. Because it did. Nolan raised both hands. This room is proving her point efficiently. Ivara set the slate on the table. We limit traffic. We inspect every load. We do not release the origin of the device. If someone dies because we kept the bridge open, we own that decision, Nolan said. Yes. She did not hesitate. Nolan studied her. She was not minimizing the danger. She was accepting a different category of danger, one he could not measure with a strain gauge. Fine, he said. Restricted traffic. Full inspection. No one enters a service passage alone. I want every old access point mapped. I want mixed teams, Ivara said. One worker from each community at every critical node. That doubles verification time. It has the number of people who can frame the other side. The logic annoyed him because it was good. Parallel checks, Nolan said. One reads load. One confirms material. Same time. Ivara nodded once. Agreed. The first mixed inspection team nearly failed before it stepped onto the bridge. A Sarah Reach technician refused to hand Tuvin a stress meter. He knows where to weaken the span. Tuvin said, I know where it was weakened because I repaired damage your artillery caused. The technician moved toward him. Ivara stepped between them. Leave the platform. The technician stared at her. You remove me for him? I remove you because you ignored an order beside a live structural fault. Nolan checked the screen the man had been holding. A crack warning flashed red. He also ignored this, Nolan said. So, now I am removing him for professional reasons. It feels more universal. Tuvin took the meter. The team continued. By the end of the shift, they had found 3 cracked braces, 2 false sensor readings, and 1 support bolt replaced with a brittle alloy that looked correct until tested. None of the faults alone would collapse the bridge. Together, they forced the crew to repair the span in a specific order. That bothered Nolan more than the mine. During the next low interference window, he descended beneath narrow span with Ivara and Tuvin. Mechanical lines connected them to the upper deck. Below, the rift opened into darkness, broken by faint electrical light crawling through mineral veins in the rock. The anchor piles vanished into the cliff and continued toward the conductive layer below. Nolan attached sensors to the first pile. Current spiked across the display. "That is too much induction," he said. Kess's voice came through the comm. "The storm front is still hours away. Then the piles are coupling with something below us." Tuvin braced a hand against the wall as a faint tremor passed through the service ledge. "That vibration has been happening for months." Months. It was blamed on settlement. Nolan saved the reading. Settlement does not usually arrive in a repeating electrical rhythm. They moved deeper into the maintenance passage and found a cable bundle hidden behind an old armor plate. It did not appear in any plan Nolan had seen. The passage ended at a military door. Ivara placed her hand against the interface. Pale lines brightened along her wrist and neck. The lock opened, but the light did not release her. Her body stiffened. Nolan saw the current jump. Ivara disconnected. He reached for the manual breaker beside the frame and pulled. The interface died. Ivara fell back in him. For 1 second, all her weight rested against his chest. Then she pushed upright, jaw tight. "I am functional." That is a very formal way to say you nearly collapsed. The system held the connection too long. Nolan removed the access module and checked. The buffer. It stored part of your neural confirmation. That is normal. Not after the door opened. Footprints marked the dust beyond the threshold. Fresh cuts showed where someone had opened the insulation around the hidden cable. A narrow tunnel led away into the old wartime passages. A warning sounded from above. Interference was rising. "We cannot follow," Tuvin said. Nolan hated leaving an open trail, but the current in the anchor piles was climbing. Remote winches would soon stop responding. They withdrew. As the lift carried them toward the deck, Nolan looked down at the dark rift, then at the copied neural record in his hand. The bridge was not merely damaged. Someone was teaching it to recognize the wrong owner. The replacement actuator Nolan needed was stored at a depot controlled by Orlon Vex transport network. That fact alone did not make Orlon guilty. After the war, almost every shipment crossing the long routes around Narrow Rift passed through one of his yards. Fuel, machine parts, coolant, and food all moved under contracts he had built from the ruins of the military supply system. It did make him unavoidable. Ivara requested 3 separate delivery schedules. Each showed a different canyon stop. Only a few people received the complete details for any one route. "You expect an ambush," Nolan said as he checked the construction lifter assigned to the convoy. "I expect information to move." That is a graceful way to describe betrayal. Betrayal is a conclusion. "I'm still collecting facts." Nolan climbed into the cab. "You are riding with a route most likely to leak." "Yes. You could send a decoy." "I could send workers who do not know they are decoys." That sounded like disapproval. It was. He looked through the open cab at her. "Good. I was hoping your command style included survival instincts." Ivara climbed onto the side platform. "Drive." The convoy left Sarah Reach during a low interference window. 2 cargo carriers held alloy beams and replacement control hardware. Nolan's lifter traveled between them. Ivara rode with a mixed security team, while Tuvin stayed at narrow span to prepare the mounting points. The route cut through. Old trenches carved into dark stone. Wind pushed metallic dust across the road. The first warning was not a shot. It was a sudden death of every navigation display. The lead carrier drifted toward the canyon wall. Nolan switched to manual steering. Signal jammer. An explosion behind them dropped rock across the road. A second blast opened a crater ahead. Directional charges fired from the ridge, striking the side of the rear carrier. Symbols painted on one launcher matched old torn basin markings. "Too obvious." "Keep the engines running," Nolan said. "They want us stopped." A mine indicator flashed beneath the lead vehicle. The road ahead was seeded with explosives. Nolan extended the lifter arm, grabbed one of the alloy beams, and lowered it across the crater like a narrow bridge. The beam flexed but held. "Lead carrier across, one will line at a time." Gunfire struck the lifter's armor. The cab shook. Ivara and 4 security officers dropped into a trench and moved toward the ridge. She did not charge the firing position. She watched the pattern, waited for the launcher to cycle, then sent 2 officers left while she crossed the exposed gap to the jammer. Nolan drove the first carrier onto the beam. Its rear axle slipped. He caught the chassis with the lifter clamp and shoved it straight. "Your machine is not rated to do that," Kessa said over a broken comm channel from the bridge. "Neither am I, but we are both broadening our experience." The second carrier crossed as Ivara reached the jammer. A defender stepped from behind it. She struck his weapon aside, drove him against the housing, and cut power to the device. Navigation returned in fragments. The remaining attackers fled through the trenches. Ivara captured one who had been stunned by the shutdown. His equipment carried an old maintenance code used by wartime logistics units. He believed the convoy was transporting weapons for Sarah Reach. "Who told you?" Ivara asked. "A coordinator. We were protecting the basin. By attacking medicine infrastructure?" "It was not medicine." The man looked honestly confused. They recovered only half the material. One beam had been damaged, and the replacement actuator had taken a direct hit. But the ambush revealed which schedule had leaked. It was the route issued through a supply branch tied to Orlon's network. Not proof. Direction. Back at Narrowspan, the lost material forced Nolan to find alloy somewhere else. Tuvin suggested an abandoned military tunnel below the torn approach. Its inner walls had been reinforced with armor plates thick enough to cut into replacement braces. The tunnel had not been used since the war. "That phrase is becoming less comforting every time I hear it," Nolan said. The mixed crew entered on foot with a compact lifter. Nolan inspected the first 100 yards. The visible supports matched the old records, though many had been patched. Tuvin stopped beside one brace. "This replacement is wrong. It passed the surface test. The grain pattern is too smooth." Nolan scraped the coating and exposed brittle metal underneath. Someone had inserted a weak beam, then concealed it with a harder shell. "Back out," he said. The ceiling cracked. The brace failed before the crew could retreat. Stone and armor plating came down between them, dividing the tunnel into 3 chambers. A coolant line split overhead. Silver fluid sprayed across the floor, spreading cold vapor. Emergency doors slammed shut. "The old fire system," Tuvin said through the comm, "it is reducing oxygen." Nolan was trapped with 6 workers near the lifter. Ivara was on the far side of the first door. Tuvin and 4 others were between 2 sealed barriers. "Status," Ivara said. "Tuvin's section has 1 injured," Nolan answered. "My ceiling is trying to become flooring." He drove the lifter beneath a sagging crossbeam and raised the arm. The roof settled onto it with a violent thud. The machine's pressure warning climbed. Tuvin found a narrow break in the debris. A Sarah Reach worker on Nolan's side could reach it, but the injured torn worker beyond the gap was running out of air. The Sarah Reach worker removed his spare breathing cylinder and pushed it through. Nolan recognized him as the man who had refused to share equipment with Tuvin on the first day. "Keep enough for yourself," Nolan said. "He needs it more." The cylinder disappeared through the gap. Ivara entered a ventilation shaft above her section. The route was barely wide enough for her armor. An automated defense unit activated inside, extending a cutting arm toward her. She trapped it against the wall with her shoulder, tore loose its power cable, and continued. Nolan watched the lifter pressure cross the safe line. "Machine will hold 3 more minutes," he said. "It must hold 5, Tuvin replied. "Please explain that to the machine. It respects authority." Ivara reached the rear control panel and opened the inner door manually. Tuvin's group moved through, carrying the injured worker. The lifter groaned. "Everyone out," Nolan ordered. The workers crawled over the debris. Nolan stayed at the controls. Ivara appeared through the vapor. "Leave it. If I release now, the last 2 do not clear." She turned, pulled the final worker by his harness, and threw him through the doorway. "Now!" Nolan locked the lifter arm mechanically and jumped. Ivara caught his shoulder as the roof collapsed behind them. The machine vanished beneath stone. They reached open air with the injured worker alive and the armor plates lost. For several minutes, no one spoke. Workers from Sarah Reach shared heaters with people from Torn Basin. Tuvin checked the man who had given away his breathing cylinder. Mira treated both without asking which side they came from. Nolan sat on a tool case while Ivara examined the tear in his sleeve. "You stayed with the lifter too long," she said. "It had become emotionally dependent on me. It was a machine. That explains why it listened better than most committees. There are no committees here. Then perhaps this assignment can still be saved." She looked toward the workers helping one another. "My mixed teams delayed us. They also prevented half those people from deciding the other half caused the collapse. That is almost an apology. Do not become greedy." The next morning, Nolan changed the inspection system. Instead of one worker checking and another repeating the task, Kessa and Tuvin would measure different parts of the same condition at the same time. Electrical load and material strain would be confirmed in parallel. It preserved Ivara's cross-check without wasting the entire low interference window. Ivara gave Nolan authority to close the traffic lane for short periods without waiting for her approval, as long as Mira received enough notice to reschedule medical loads. Their cooperation became faster because it was no longer a contest over who controlled the bridge. During another inspection beneath the span, a shard of alloy cut through Nolan's protective sleeve. The tear was small, but the electric field was not. Current crawled across his arm and locked his hand. Ivara pulled him behind an insulated rib. She removed the reserve shielding from her own suit and sealed it over the tear. "You need that," he said. "You need it first." The return climb took 12 minutes. Without the reserve layer, Ivara's suit absorbed more induction than it should. By the time they reached the deck, the light bands along her neck flickered irregularly. Mira ordered her to sit. "I am functional," Ivara said. Nolan crouched beside her. "You use that phrase when the truth is less encouraging." Later, he rebuilt the damaged section of her suit with material already stored for sensor shielding. He added a simple current spreader and tested it twice. Ivara examined the work. "You altered military equipment without authorization." "I was trying to avoid a report explaining why the local commander was cooked inside a service duct. The report concerning unauthorized modification will be longer." "Excellent. We are planning for your survival and my paperwork." This time she smiled clearly. It changed her face more than Nolan expected. He looked away before the observation became obvious. Kessa interrupted them with new data. Small power pulses had appeared after every emergency access Ivara performed. The pulses traveled through the hidden cable toward the center of narrow span. They entered the passage during the next low-interference window. The first door recognized Ivara. The second had no active interface, only a physical locking wheel fused by heat. Nolan cut the housing and turned it manually. A third pressure trap used torn engineering, and Tuvin disabled it by venting the chamber in stages. No one person could have reached the center alone. The hidden chamber contained rows of old capacitors built into the bridge ribs. Thick conductors ran toward both Sarah Reach and Torn Basin. Kessa studied the remaining diagrams. "This system can draw from both grids." "Where does the power go?" Ivara asked. Kessa's face hardened. "Back to the grids." Nolan traced the paths. The capacitors were distributed across the span, so no single strike could disable them. When charged together, they could send a pulse into both ends, destroying the power station, cooling controls, and nearby infrastructure. "A denial system," Tuvin said. "If one side captured the bridge, neither side would keep it." "It is incomplete," Kessa said. "The stabilizers are offline. The grids are not synchronized." Nolan looked at the repair map on his slate. The replacement actuator, the phase controller, the central braces, the hidden cable. Every failure had forced them to restore one of those pieces. He overlaid the sabotage timeline on the work schedule. The pattern became obvious. "They are not trying to stop us," he said. Ivara looked at the map. "They are choosing what we repair." The system required a command identity. Ivara opened the access record. Her neural signature appeared in fragments across multiple emergency nodes. Each time she had opened a door, stopped a defense system, or rescued workers, the infected interface had copied another part of her command pattern. The mind had tested Nolan's procedures. The emergencies had harvested Ivara's authority. Kessa said, "If the fragments are combined, someone may be able to build a usable command key." Ivara stood very still. Then remove me from the system. Tuvin shook his head. Without you, we cannot open the remaining military controls. And if she continues, Nolan said, we may give them the final piece. Outside the chamber, the bridge carried a coolant convoy across the rift. Its wheels sent a low vibration through the walls. Nolan stared at the capacitors around them. If they stopped repairing Narrow Span, Torren Basin would lose power and Sarah Reach would lose cooling when the storm arrived. If they continued as planned, they would finish a weapon designed to destroy both. The bridge had turned their best work against them. For the first time since Nolan arrived, he and Ivara did not argue over which danger mattered more. They were looking at the same one. The command record inside the hidden chamber listed Ivara as one of the surviving officers authorized to complete the denial system. Nolan read the line twice. Ivara watched him from across the old control table. Ask, did you know what this chamber was? No. Did you know the bridge had a final destruction protocol? I knew there was a protected system. I was ordered to hold the central span. I was not told what the system did. Tuvin looked away. Kessa remained beside the capacitor map, giving them the closest thing the cramped chamber allowed to privacy. Nolan closed the file. Were you involved in destroying the bridge? Yes. The answer landed harder because it came without defense. Ivara removed a small data module from inside her armor and placed it on the table. This is everything I retained from the last day of the war. You kept military records after the armistice. I kept evidence that could condemn me in two different ways. Nolan connected the module to an isolated reader. The records were damaged. Timestamps skipped. Several video feeds ended in static. What remained showed a civilian column crossing Narrow Span while troops advanced behind it. Ivara's old command had ordered complete demolition. She had not carried it out. Instead, charges had severed one outer span and blocked the military approach while the civilian lane remained intact for several minutes. A later strike destroyed the rest. My unit was ordered to withdraw after the full demolition, Ivara said. Because I delayed it, part of the unit was trapped. Some died. My side remembers that. Torren Basin remembers only that I gave the detonation order. Why did you never release this? The data cannot prove who was in every vehicle. It can be cut to show that I protected an enemy advance or that I murdered civilians. I would become a symbol for whichever side edited it first. Nolan loaded the structural scans he had taken during his first inspection. The old fracture directions matched a controlled outer span cut, not a full central demolition. The weight pattern in the surviving deck indicated the civilian lane had remained loaded after the military route failed. Physics did not tell him whether Ivara had been afraid, angry, or brave. It did tell him she was telling the truth about what she had done. He created a new control layer in the isolated system. From now on, the core requires two approvals, he said. Yours and mine. You trust me. I trust the evidence. I also trust the decisions I've watched you make. Neither of those means one person should control bridge. Ivara studied the new lock. Agreed. The words were quiet, but something changed between them. Nolan had not excused her past or demanded she defend it. Ivara had not asked him to surrender caution as proof of loyalty. They had chosen a boundary together. Kessa found the next problem before they left the chamber. The stolen neural key was incomplete. One final class of confirmation was missing, a stress response pattern used when a commander entered an emergency override. If Ivara never accesses another military node, they cannot complete it, Kessa said. Tuvin pointed at the remaining locked sections of Narrow Span. Then we cannot isolate the denial system before the storm. Ivara looked at the network map. We make them ask for the missing pattern. Nolan understood first. You want to offer a false one. A command station can be isolated from a bridge. If the theft program reaches for the data, we trace the physical return path. The interface may know the pattern is false. It will reject it by sending the rejection through your nervous system. I'm aware. No, you're familiar with military briefings that called nerve damage an acceptable operational cost. Her gaze sharpened, and you are familiar with deciding that your skill makes you the correct person to enter every dangerous space. That stopped him. Ivara stepped closer to the map. Removing me from the system protects me. It also protects the person stealing my identity. This is my access, my risk, and my choice. Nolan did not like it. That did not make her wrong. Then I build the limiter, he said. And I set a manual disconnect. You will not cut the link because you become uncomfortable. I cut it at the threshold we agree on. Or, if I cannot confirm. Agreed. They used a decommissioned command terminal in an isolated maintenance room. Nolan built the limiter from the same shielding mesh he had added to Ivara's suit, a mechanical breaker, and a current sensor that did not depend on the bridge network. Ivara sat in the interface chair. Pale contact bands closed around her forearms and neck. Your pulse is elevated, Nolan said. You are monitoring it. I thought I would mention that the equipment is working. Do you always talk this much before dangerous procedures? Only when the patient is intimidating. I'm not your patient. That is why I said intimidating. Kessa initiated the false login. The interface lit. Ivara's body tightened as the system read the altered pattern. Data moved through the isolated cable, then reached outward. Tuvin tracked the signal across old maintenance relays. A warning crossed Nolan's display. Approaching the first limit. Continue, Ivara said. The return path moved beyond narrow span into a supply communication line. Her right hand began to tremble. Second limit. Continue. The signal reached a warehouse relay on the Sarah Reach side. Ivara's fingers stopped moving. Nolan put his hand on the breaker. Confirm. She forced out one word. Continue. The trace locked onto a transport depot. Current crossed the agreed threshold. Nolan pulled the breaker. The contacts released. Ivara folded forward, breathing hard. Her right arm hung motionless. For one terrible instant, Nolan wondered whether he had waited too long. Then she raised her left hand and removed the neck contact. You followed the agreement, she said. You say that, as if surprised. I was not certain concern would leave your judgment intact. Concern is allowed to complain. It does not get command authority. She looked at him for a long moment. Good. Mira confirmed the loss of motion was temporary, though Ivara would have reduced strength for several hours. That limit determined the next mission. She could guide and fight if necessary, but not sustain a long engagement. The trace depot belonged to Orlan's network. They entered during the next rise in solar interference, when the warehouse sensors produced enough false alarms to hide their approach. Nolan drove a maintenance vehicle through a lower cargo access. Ivara sat beside him with her right arm secured against her body. Kessa and Tuvin rode in the rear. The depot appeared abandoned. Then the doors locked behind them and conveyor systems activated at full speed. Cargo frames swept through the aisles. Robotic loaders began moving containers toward an industrial furnace. They are destroying the inventory, Kessa said. And anyone left inside it, Tuvin added. Workers pounded against a sealed cage near the loading floor. They had been locked in when Orlan's people withdrew. Ivara pointed toward the control booth. The data core is there. Nolan looked at the trapped workers and the furnace line. We split. Tuvin, free them. Kessa, keep the power from cycling. Ivara and I take the booth. They ran between moving cargo frames. Nolan jammed a mechanical bar into one conveyor and used the maintenance vehicle to drag a container off the track. Ivara covered the crossing, firing short pulses at loader joints rather than the workers hidden beyond them. They reached the booth as the data system began a thermal purge. Nolan ripped open the cooling panel. I can keep the storage alive or stop the furnace. I will stop the furnace, Ivara said. With one working arm, the controls require a command code, not two arms. She entered an old logistics override. The furnace slowed, but security units emerged from the upper racks. Nolan used a cargo hook to pull one from its rail. Ivara disabled another at close range, favoring her left side. Kessa rerouted power. Tuvin freed the workers. Nolan saved only part of the depot records before the core burned. It was enough. They found shipments of brittle alloy, Terran connector boards, neural recording modules, and maintenance codes used in every major sabotage. Energy draw at the depot matched the hidden pulses from narrow-span Orlan. Had already left. There was no speech waiting in the records, no single file labeled with his plan. The evidence showed a network of divided tasks. One group supplied material. Another altered access logs. Others believed they were preventing a military takeover. Few knew the bridge could destroy both communities. The last surviving schedule contained a target time near the planned grid connection. He is moving early, Ivara said. The depot loss had forced Orlan to accelerate. The rescued depot workers were not part of Orlan's inner network. They had been ordered to remain on shift after the supervisors withdrew, then locked inside when the purge began. Mira examined them in the maintenance vehicle while Nolan drove back toward Narrowspan. One worker had inhaled smoke. Another had a burned hand from trying to force the cage controls. They were left as evidence, Ivara said from the passenger seat. Evidence of what? If we died in the depot, the workers would be found beside Terran tools and torn access codes. If we escaped without them, Orlan could say we destroyed a civilian warehouse. Nolan kept his eyes on the road. He designs blame the way I designed temporary supports. Every piece carries weight somewhere else. You sound impressed. I am recognizing competence. It makes him more dangerous, not more admirable. Ivara's right hand remained secured in its brace. The pain medicine had made the light bands along her neck dim, but she was still reviewing the saved records. One shipment repeats, she said. Field cells moved from a military salvage yard to 3 civilian depots, then disappeared. Capacitor-grade material? Yes. Nolan considered the denial system. Orlan had been collecting parts long before the repair project began. He had not created the plan after hearing that Narrowspan would reopen. He had prepared for the possibility that someone might eventually try. Another record showed that Orlan had purchased fragments of Terran safety documentation through a subcontractor. The documents were not classified. They were ordinary training procedures, exactly the sort of information a supplier would claim to need. He did not know me, Nolan said. He knew what my organization teaches. The mine on the reset bus was aimed at the most predictable, qualified response. Ivara looked toward him. Does that trouble you? It should. Standard procedure keeps people alive because everyone understands it. It also creates habits someone can study. You changed the procedure. After I saw the trap, you saw it because you did not rush. Nolan glanced at her. That almost sounded complimentary. You were effective. Careful. Excessive praise can damage a contractor's judgment. You are no longer officially a contractor. Then, I am defenseless. She looked back at the data, but the slight movement at the corner of her mouth remained. The records contained one older file that was not connected directly to the sabotage. It described a wartime convoy Orlan had commanded during a brief ceasefire. The route had been opened for medical evacuation. An opposing unit had used the same corridor to move soldiers into firing positions, and Orlan's convoy had been destroyed during the attack. The report did not excuse what he was doing now. It explained why he believed every shared route would eventually become a weapon. He built his entire future around never being surprised that way again, Ivara said. And now he creates the betrayal before anyone else can. He will call it prevention. Nolan slowed as the road approached the bridge. People can make almost anything sound responsible when they only count the lives on their side. Ivara went quiet. He realized too late that the statement had touched the last day of the war. I did not mean you, he said. You should have. Nolan looked at her. I spent years telling myself I kept the civilian lane open because it was correct, she continued. That is true. I also knew my own soldiers would pay for the delay. I chose which danger I could accept for other people. You made a decision inside a collapsing battle. So did you at your previous project. You read my file. I read the part your course sent. And people judge me by the equipment I lost. Did that make them wrong? No. It made the result incomplete. Ivara rested her left hand on the brace around her. Right arm. Then perhaps that is what trust is. Not deciding the other person was always right. Deciding their choices are worth understanding completely. Nolan pulled the vehicle to a stop near the bridge workshop. That is uncomfortably thoughtful, he said. I was hoping trust involved fewer difficult conversations. You could return to arguing about inspection schedules. Tempting, but I suspect we have progressed beyond them. Mira opened the rear door and called for help moving the injured workers. Ivara reached for her harness with her left hand. Nolan unfastened it before she had to struggle, then paused rather than pulling her upright without permission. She held out her left hand. He took it. The contact lasted only long enough to help her stand, but neither treated it as accidental. Behind them, the rescued workers began unloading the save data core beside people from both communities. No one asked which side had owned the warehouse or which uniform the injured had once worn. For Nolan, the absence of that question mattered almost as much as the evidence they had carried out. Before the rescued workers had finished unloading, an orbital warning arrived. The stellar eruption was stronger than predicted, and the storm front would reach Etreia almost a full day sooner. At Sarah Reach, Kessa began shutting down generators to prevent overheating. Mira received word that the Torrent Basin Hospital had transferred its critical care systems to reserve power. The long transport routes were already closing. Nolan reviewed every remaining source of stabilizer hardware. Only one complete unit existed within reach. Anchor Site 7 lay inside the cliff below Narrowspan. It had been sealed after the war. Ivara's former Sarah Reach command controlled the outer defense system. Torrent Basin engineers had built the stabilizer stored inside. Opening it would expose military schematics. Both communities had spent years hiding from each other. Ivara contacted the former officers who still recognized her command authority. They ordered her to wait for approval. How long? She asked. Until the Security Council can assemble. The hospital reserve will fail before then. The site cannot be opened to Torrent engineers. Then it cannot be opened at all. That may be preferable. Ivara ended the connection. She looked at Tuvin. Can you remove the stabilizer without detonating its field cells? If I can see the original control sequence. You will. She used her remaining authority to open Anchor Site 7 and transferred access to the mixed crew. The response came within minutes. Her command credentials were revoked. No arrest team arrived. There was no time for one. But every formal symbol of her position vanished from the system. The workers still followed her into the cliff. Anchor Site 7 smelled of dust and sealed machinery. Nolan drove the replacement lifter through the main corridor while Tuvin identified dormant traps. Ivara guided them along a maintenance route she remembered from the war. They reached the stabilizer vault and began disconnecting the unit. Orlon's code woke the defenses. Doors slammed shut. Fire suppression systems lowered the oxygen. A blast beneath the vault floor tilted the stabilizer rack and dropped part of the ceiling. 6 workers were trapped beyond a falling support frame. The lifter could carry the stabilizer out, or it could hold the ceiling. Not both. Nolan checked the beam angle, the oxygen timer, and the path to the exit. He had made a version of this choice before. Then, he had acted before anyone could question him, and spent years insisting there had been no choice. This time, he looked at Ivara. If I hold the roof, the stabilizer drops. I know. We may not be able to rebuild it. I know. The workers have less than 4 minutes. Ivara met his eyes. Then decide. Nolan drove the lifter beneath the failing beam and raised the arm. The stabilizer rack slid from its supports and crashed onto the lower platform. Tuvin opened the maintenance exit. Ivara led the trapped workers through one by one. The lifter's pressure climbed beyond its rated limit. Nolan stayed at the controls until Ivara returned and pulled open the cab. Everyone is clear. The ceiling descended. Nolan locked the arm, jumped, and ran with her as the vault collapsed behind them. Outside Anchor Site 7, the damaged stabilizer lay in pieces on a cargo sled. Its central control core remained intact. Most of the field hardware did not. Bram Keeler, Nolan's core supervisor, contacted him from the Terran evacuation ship. The storm classification has exceeded project limits, Bram said. All core personnel are ordered off Etreia. Your departure window is 40 minutes. The denial system is active. You no longer have the equipment to isolate it. We have part of it. Nolan, this is the same decision that nearly ended your career before. No, last time I pretended I could save everything. And now I know exactly what I am losing. Bram's face tightened. If you refuse extraction, I revoke your project authority and recommend suspension of your field license. Understood. You will not receive another transport. Understood. Bram waited, perhaps hoping Nolan would change his mind. Nolan ended the call. Ivara stood beside the broken stabilizer, her command credentials gone and one arm still weak. So, Nolan said, between us, we have no authority, no working stabilizer, and a bridge full of explosives. You forgot the storm. I was saving the encouraging part. Around them, the mixed crew began gathering tools. No one left. Tuvin spent 10 minutes examining the broken stabilizer core before giving his answer. The control units survived. The field rings did not. Kessa knelt beside the twisted housing. Can we fabricate new rings? Not from civil stock. They require military-grade conductors and armor. No one spoke. Nolan looked from Tuvin to Ivara. Both communities kept weapons. Kessa's expression closed. Tuvin looked at the floor. The armistice had required disarmament around Narrowspan. The speed with which armed groups had appeared during every crisis had already told Nolan the requirement was more aspiration than fact. Ivara turned toward the Sarah Reach and the bridge. There's a sealed store beneath the western approach. Kessa stared at her. Your side kept a depot under the bridge. My side kept several. I know the location of one. If you open it, every record of the disarmament agreement becomes evidence against you. My command. Authority is already gone. That is not the same as admitting a hidden weapons store. Ivara started walking. It is now. The depot held pulse emitters, armored field housings, and capacitor packs preserved for a war no one officially expected to resume. Ivara opened it with a manual code before her revoked credentials could block the lock. Workers gathered at the entrance. Some looked relieved, others looked ashamed. A few looked at the weapons with the familiarity of people who had always known they were there. Tuvin spoke quietly to Kessa. Torren Basin has a storage room beneath the old pumping station. Kessa looked at him. You knew. I helped seal it. She was silent, then sent a message to her grid crew. Open it. Bring the field cells. Nolan built a temporary workshop on the Sarah Reach approach. The work happened in full view of both communities. He cut armored housings away from weapons and shaped them around the stabilizer core. Tuvin stripped field rings from old defense emitters. Kessa rewired capacitor packs into a phase-balancing assembly. No one could pretend the weapons had vanished into the hands of the former enemy. They watched them become pieces of a bridge. The material was enough for one rebuilt stabilizer. One attempt, Nolan said. Tuvin tightened the final brace. You usually sound happier when the odds are poor. I'm trying maturity. I dislike it. Ivara stood beside the half-finished unit. The strength had returned to her right arm, though her hand still shook when she held it out too long. Disabling the denial system will not make the bridge safe, she said. Nolan looked at the old load plans. You mean the military capacity? If Sarah Reach can move a large force across in minutes, Torren Basin will never trust the span. If one grid can close every section, the other side will never depend on it. He had been treating the political fear as a condition around the structure. Ivara was asking him to place the answer inside the structure itself. Nolan spread the bridge diagram across the work table. What if there is no single bridge control? Kessa frowned. There must be a master system. There was. That is how someone built a self-destruct mechanism into it. He divided Narrowspan into independent load sections. Each section would require confirmation from both ends before accepting a major power change. If one side tried to seize full control, the segments would isolate themselves. Tuvin pointed at the center lane. A military column could still cross before anyone reacts. Nolan pulled up the load calculations from the medicine convoy. Not if the physical threshold is lower than the weight pattern of a rapid column. Civil carriers cross with spacing. Rescue vehicles cross one at a time. A concentrated military load triggers mechanical locks between sections. Kessa studied the power estimate. It reduces transmission capacity. So does a destroyed bridge. Torren Basin needs more than the minimum. Sarah Reach does too, Tuvin said. They began calculating what each community required to survive the storm. not what either preferred to receive. Kessa surrendered part of the phase authority to Tuvin. Tuvin accepted a lower coolant flow so the hospital could keep its air systems. The design did not ask them to trust good intentions. It limited what bad intentions could accomplish. Ivara looked at Nolan. "You're building social policy into load controls. I have been exposed to a dangerous local influence. Should I apologize? Not until we know whether it works." The rebuilt stabilizer was almost ready when alarms sounded at both ends of Narrow Span. A water control station in Torn Basin had been attacked. Seconds later, Sarah Reach reported sabotage at its phase balancing station. Images showed attackers at each site wearing markings of the opposite community. People began gathering near supply depots. Old accusations moved faster than verified reports. Ivara did not call a council. She did not make a public speech. She assigned the workers who had survived the collapsed tunnel to the threatened stations in mixed teams. Kessa took responsibility for the Sarah Reach power end. Tuvin moved to the Torn water control. Mira established a joint aid station on Narrow Span, treating injured people from either side under the same roof. Nolan examined the damaged feeds. The attacks looked severe, but they had missed the components that would cause permanent failure. They were designed to draw security away from the bridge. "Orlan wants the auxiliary nodes empty," he said. Ivara saw it at once. "He is moving on the core." She recalled the mixed teams from positions that could survive briefly without them and placed them at the bridge's section controls. It meant leaving the water station and power station at unsafe operating margins. "If we are wrong," Kessa said through the comm, "the generator overheats. If we are right and leave the bridge open," Ivara replied, "there will be no generator." The storm struck the upper atmosphere. Blue-white discharge rolled across the sky. Every electronic display on Narrow Span flickered. Remote sensors began reporting contradictory loads. Then the communication line between the two ends died. Explosions hit 3 support ribs in sequence. The deck jumped under Nolan's boots. Hidden defense turrets unfolded inside the lower tunnels. Armed teams entered through maintenance routes using old logistics codes. At the same moment, the denial capacitors began drawing power. Orlan had completed a false command key from Ivara's stolen neural patterns. Kessa's voice broke through on a narrow emergency channel. "The grids are being pulled together. Phase difference is rising. Tuvin, hold your end at the emergency frequency," Nolan said. "I cannot hear Kessa." Nolan struck a wrench against the support beam 3 times, paused, then twice. Tuvin answered through the structure. During the redesign, they had created a mechanical signal code for the possibility that the storm destroyed radio. Simple pulse patterns could travel through the bridge ribs even when electronics failed. Kessa received the matching sequence at the Sarah Reach end. The 2 engineers began adjusting power by physical instruments and time vibration. The mixed teams held the auxiliary stations. Some were attacked by people wearing the symbols of their former enemies. This time, they did not abandon position at the first familiar marking. They checked identity, protected one another, and kept the local sections operating. Nolan secured the rebuilt stabilizer to a maintenance sled. "I take this to the center ribs," he said. Ivara checked the charge on her sidearm and flexed her recovering hand. "I take the core. You may not have full strength." "I do not need full strength to enter a command key. You will need it if Orlan put people inside. That is why I have the other hand." He looked at her. "There is a deeply unreasonable part of me that finds that reassuring. I have met that part." Mira tightened the shield layer on Ivara's suit. Nolan checked the limiter he had built for the false login trap and connected it to the core interface harness. He routed a second mechanical release to the maintenance vehicle waiting beside the center access, so he could still cut Ivara free if the chamber sealed. "Same rules," he said. "You confirm each stage. I cut only at the limit or if you cannot answer. And if the bridge load threatens both communities, you isolate my section. That may drop the span you are standing on." "Yes." Ivara's gaze held his. "You are giving me permission to kill you. I am giving you authority to protect everyone else. There is a difference." She touched the front of his suit, just above the harness lock. It was not an embrace. It was a brief, deliberate confirmation that he was real and standing in front of her. "Come back before I need to use it," she said. Nolan lifted the tool pack. "That was my preferred interpretation." They separated. Nolan descended onto the outer rib system as the storm made the bridge glow. Remote clamps failed within minutes, forcing him to secure the sled with mechanical hooks. Wind poured through the rift. The rebuilt stabilizer dragged at his line. The first explosive was fixed to a brace he could reach. He isolated its trigger and removed the charge. The second was wired into a sensor cluster. He cut the mechanical firing pin and left the dead casing in place. The third sat on a cracked rib beyond a section already bending under load. He could not remove it without placing his weight on the weakest point. Nolan marked the rib for controlled separation. Inside the central chamber, Ivara entered the neural interface. The stolen command key had. "Open the outer layers." Her true pattern challenged it for control. Pain traveled along her arms as the system compared the two identities. She confirmed the first lock. The denial capacitors continued charging. An armed team entered the corridor outside. Ivara sealed the inner door, but the attackers began cutting through it. She used the old defense map to close barriers behind them and trap part of the group between sections. At the auxiliary stations, Kessa and Tuvin maintained the phase through mechanical pulses. The timing was crude, but stable enough to stop the fields from tearing the bridge immediately. Nolan reached the center mounting point. The rebuilt stabilizer fit the housing, but the old coupling had warped. He took out a manual cutter. "Of course," he muttered. "A bridge that accepts no standard replacement. I respect the commitment to being difficult." Ivara's voice reached him through a brief, clear interval. "Are you speaking to the bridge again? It has seniority." The connection vanished. He cut away the warped edge and locked the unit with physical bolts. The denial system crossed 3/4 of its charge threshold. The storm intensified. Current flowed through the anchor piles, shaking the cliff. Nolan calculated the options from physical gauges. If they cut all power, Torn Basin's air systems would fail, and Sarah Reach would lose generator control. If he detonated the center span, the denial capacitors would separate from the grids, but narrow span would be gone for years. The anchor readings from the first inspection offered a third path. The piles were already pulling induced current into the conductive rock below. With the rebuilt stabilizer as a guide, the stored energy could be released downward in short pulses. Each pulse would increase bridge vibration. The central span could survive 3 at most. Nolan restored a weak audio connection to the core. "Ivara, I have an option." She was breathing hard. "Give me the cost." He explained the 3 pulses, the manual guide, and the risk to the span. He did not soften the neural load she would face while holding the discharge route open. She gave him the denial system's remaining time. "Less than 6 minutes. We can destroy the middle now," Nolan said. "Both communities survive the immediate blast. The bridge does not. And Orlon keeps control of the long routes. Yes, or we hold it. You risk permanent interface damage. I may not have a return path after the second pulse. Probability? Poor. That is not a number, because I do not have one worth trusting." She was silent long enough that he thought the connection had failed. Then she said, "We hold it." Nolan closed his eyes for 1 second. Agreed. They repeated the limits. Ivara would maintain the core through the final pulse. Nolan could cut her interface afterward or earlier only if she lost the ability to confirm. Ivara could detonate his section if its failure threatened the grid ends. No hidden costs. No heroic lies. "Interesting assignment," Nolan said. "I came to repair a bridge, and now you are formally authorized to blow up the part 1 I'm standing on. You sound pleased. I'm attempting to remain professionally open-minded. Try not to enjoy it." The storm swallowed the channel. Ivara confirmed the first discharge path. Nolan locked his boots against the rib and armed the rebuilt stabilizer. The bridge released its first pulse into the dark beneath narrow rift. The first pulse did not sound like an explosion. It sounded like the entire bridge taking one enormous breath. Current rushed through the rebuilt stabilizer, down the anchor piles, and into the conductive rock beneath the rift. Blue light flashed across the cliff walls. The central span rose half an inch, then slammed back against its joints. Nolan's physical gauges jumped. Stored energy dropped by a third. Stress on the center ribs nearly doubled. Inside the core, Ivara felt the discharge as a hard wave through the neural interface. The limiter absorbed part of it. The rest drove through her shoulders and down her spine. Her right hand went numb. Confirm status, Nolan said over the weak line. Conscious. Control intact. The cutting tools outside, the chamber broke through the first layer of the door. Ivara closed a secondary barrier, but the old system responded slowly. The false command pattern still occupied part of the network, opening pathways as quickly as she sealed them. She stopped trying to fight it at every point. Instead, she followed the pattern to the permission tree that gave it authority. Each stolen fragment came from a real emergency access. The false key was strong because it had been built from choices she had made to save people. She began deleting those old military permissions one by one. Every deletion reduced her own control along with the false keys. That was the price. To remove Orlan's access, she had to destroy hers too. On the outer ribs, Nolan crawled toward the cracked support holding the third explosive. He could not remove the charge, but he could decide where the rib would break. He fixed two shaped cutting packs from his original demolition kit to the healthier side of the brace. They were not powerful enough to sever a main beam. They did not need to. They only had to direct the failure away from the rebuilt stabilizer. He checked the mechanical load marks. The second pulse had to begin before the denial capacitors recovered from the first. Kessa and Tuvin sent the ready signal through the beams. 3 strikes, pause, 1 strike. Nolan answered. Ivara confirmed the second path. The energy released. The bridge twisted violently. Nolan's left safety line snapped. His second line caught and threw him against the rib. Pain flared along his side, but his suit remained sealed. The cracked support began to split toward the main span. Nolan triggered his cutting packs. The controlled brake raced along the line he had prepared. The damaged rib tore free on the outside instead of pulling the stabilizer housing inward. A section of an used service deck folded into the rift. The main lane survived. One of the auxiliary gauges did not. Nolan watched the needle drop to 0. The center section no longer had enough lateral support to remain connected after the final pulse. He had expected the possibility. Seeing it become certainty was different. At Sarah Reach, Kessa held the grid near the minimum phase level. The generator temperature climbed. A security team tried to force entry into the balance station, claiming Torn Basin had already seized the bridge. The workers beside Kessa recognized one of the attackers as a transport guard employed through Orlan's network. They did not open the door. At Torn Basin, a coolant valve jammed half-closed. Tuvin could either leave the phase controls or lose water flow to Sarah Reach. A Sarah Reach technician beside him took the manual phase lever. You taught me the pattern, she said. Go. Tuvin ran to the valve. The choice would have been unthinkable a day earlier. Now it happened without ceremony. At the bridge aid station, Mira moved injured workers away from the vibrating center. Some wore Sarah Reach equipment. Some came from Torn Basin. She sorted them by breathing, circulation, and ability to walk. No one had time to ask who deserved treatment first. Inside the core, the door failed. 2 armed men entered. Ivara could not release the interface harness without giving the false key control. She used her left hand to fire at the lights above them. Darkness filled the chamber. One attacker moved toward the interface. Ivara kicked the control stool into his legs and drove him against the wall. The second raised his weapon. A maintenance worker from a mixed team entered through the lower service hatch and struck the weapon aside with a toolbar. Another worker sealed the hatch behind him. They had disobeyed Ivara's order to remain at the auxiliary station. We held it, the first worker said. They sent us here. The workers restrained the attackers while Ivara continued deleting permissions. The denial charge fell below half, but the capacitors began rebuilding power from the 2 grids. The final pulse had to be larger. Nolan tightened the rebuilt stabilizer's manual guides. His damaged side made breathing difficult. He did not have time to determine whether anything was broken. He checked the route back. There was none. The service deck behind him had folded away. His remaining cable led to a section that was separating from a bridge. A maintenance vehicle waited on the main deck, but 20 feet of open air lay between it and his rib. He signaled Ivara. "Final guide is ready," he said. "My section will separate. Can you cross before discharge?" "No." "Can you delay?" "The capacitors will recover." He heard her breathe. "You gave me authority to isolate the section," she said. "If it threatens the ends, and if I isolate it now, the guide loses alignment. The pulse reflects towards Sarah Reach. Then I will hold your section. The last stabilizer cannot support both the guide and my rib. It can for a few seconds. The feedback will pass through your interface." "I know." Nolan gripped the rail. "Ivara, you respected my decision before. Do not stop now, because the cost has become real." He wanted to tell her no. He wanted to cut her connection, detonate the center span, and accept the ruined bridge. That would save her from the choice she had already made. It would also betray everything they had built between them. 3 seconds, he said. No more. 4. 3. Then move quickly. The light bands along Ivara's neck burned bright as she redirected the final functioning stabilizer. The system fought her because her command permissions were disappearing. She forced the field toward Nolan's separating rib. The neural feedback hit. Her right arm failed completely. Her vision narrowed. Warning tones became a single continuous note. But Nolan's rib rose. The gap to the maintenance vehicle shortened. He activated the third and final discharge. Energy tore down through the anchor piles in a controlled sequence. The first surge opened the route into the conductive layer. The second drove the stored charge deeper. The final surge shattered the denial capacitors along the center span. The false command key vanished. The bridge convulsed. Nolan released his boots and jumped. For an instant, there was only blue light beneath him and the black depth of narrow rift. The maintenance vehicle moved. From the core, Ivara operated it through a simple secondary control that did not require the military interface. With one functioning hand and vision blurred by neural overload, she drove the platform under his path. Nolan struck the roof, slid, and caught the edge. The vehicle tilted toward the rift. He tried to pull himself up. His injured side refused. A worker inside the vehicle reached through the hatch and grabbed Nolan's harness. Another caught his arm. Together, they dragged him inside as the abandoned rib fell away. "Cut her interface," Ivara said through the secondary control. Nolan crawled to the mechanical release mounted inside the vehicle. The final pulse was complete. He pulled it. The contacts opened. Ivara collapsed against the controls. The denial capacitors exploded in a chain of contained flashes along the empty service sections. The main roadway buckled but remained connected. One lane disappeared into the rift. The other held. For several seconds, no one knew whether the anchor piles would trigger a larger fault movement. The tremor passed through the bridge, into the cliffs, and faded. Narrow span remained standing. The maintenance vehicle rolled back through the service hatch. Nolan climbed into the core chamber and knelt beside Ivara. The lights along her neck were dim and uneven. He checked her breathing, then placed her left hand against his wrist. Her fingers closed. "Functional?" he asked. Her eyes opened slightly. That phrase is becoming less convincing. Finally, technical progress. A weak sound escaped her. It might have been a laugh. Nolan decided to count it. The fight continued below them. With the denial system dead, Orlon's teams lost access to the central controls. Orlon withdrew through the wartime logistics tunnels, ordering the remaining groups to keep fighting and blaming the other community for the failed discharge. Ivara could no longer use the command interface, but she knew the old retreat pattern. Orlon had built his network from military supply routes. He would choose a corridor with vehicle access, independent ventilation, and a direct path to the Sarah Reach transport yards. She marked the likely exits on Nolan's offline map. Tuvin closed the water gate across the first route. Kessa cut power to the defense doors on the second without interrupting the hospital line. Mixed work crews sealed the third with construction equipment. Orlon reached the final passage and found workers from both communities waiting behind an armored loader. He ordered his guards to fire. Several lowered their weapons instead. They had been told the operation would disable a military takeover. They had not been told the denial system would send destructive power into both communities. The rest were disarmed in a short struggle. Orlon tried to retreat, but the loader blocked the passage and a service door sealed behind him. He was captured without confession, final speech, or public revelation. The surviving depot records, maintenance codes, false materials, neural recording modules, and grid use history showed what he had done. The bridge itself carried the physical record of every manipulated repair. His deepest failure could not be stored in a file. He had assumed people would respond to old symbols exactly as they had during the war. He had expected Kessa to abandon Tuven, Torin workers to leave Sarah Reach without coolant, and every mixed team to split when the shooting began. Instead, people held positions beside those who had once been enemies. The system he had built from fear stopped working when fear was no longer the only thing connecting them. Nolan woke in Myra's aid station with a support wrap around his ribs and the storm still beating against the roof. "You have 2 cracked ribs," Myra said. "No internal damage. You will not climb anything today." "That seems unnecessarily specific. You asked whether you could return to the bridge." "I was assessing options." "You have one option. Breathe carefully." He turned his head. Ivara lay on the next medical platform. Her eyes were open. Her right arm rested motionless beside her. Myra followed his gaze. "She has partial neural damage. Some movement may return with treatment. The military interfaces she used are no longer safe for her." Ivara said, "I was not planning to use them." Nola tried to sit. Myra pushed him back with one hand. "I seem to be under strict local control," he said. "You lost your project authority," Ivara replied. "Someone had to replace it." He looked at her hand. She noticed. "My left hand works. I remember. It saved me. So did 2 maintenance workers. I will thank them when the room stops moving." "It is not moving. That is troubling." The storm lasted through the night. Narrow span transmitted power at a fraction of its intended capacity, but the fraction was enough. Sarah Reach received coolant before the generator housings reached failure temperature. Torren Basin received electricity for the hospital and atmosphere pumps before reserve cells were exhausted. The first convoy over the surviving lane carried cooling equipment towards Sarah Reach. It returned with medicine and power modules for Torren Basin. There was no ceremony. The deck was too damaged, the wind too strong, and the crews too tired. Vehicles crossed one at a time under mechanical load limits. Nolan watched from the aid station window. Bram Keeler contacted him after the storm weakened. "The core ship has departed," Bram said. "A civilian transport can take you from Atreya in 4 days." "My field license?" "Suspended pending review. The project contract is terminated." Nolan nodded. "Understood." Bram was quiet. "For what it is worth, you saved the bridge. We saved part of it. You also ignored a direct evacuation order." "Yes. I cannot erase that because the outcome was favorable. I did not expect you to." Bram's expression softened. "That may be the first mature thing you have said to me. I have been practicing. It remains unpleasant." Bram almost smiled. "Heal before you decide what comes next." After the call, Nolan found Ivara on the damaged approach to Narrow Span. Her right arm was supported in a light brace. She walked without assistance, though more slowly than before. The bridge looked worse in daylight. One traffic lane ended in open air. Burn stabilizer housings marked the center. New alloy patches stood out against the old metal. It was alive. So were both communities. The consequences arrived without delay. Ivara's removal from command became permanent. Her access to every military system was revoked, though most of those permissions had already been destroyed in the core. Some former officers called her a traitor for opening Anchor Site 7 and exposing the weapons depot. People in Torren Basin still remembered the old demolition order. Nolan's Terran credentials no longer opened project equipment. His name had been removed from the official repair authority. Neither loss was. Repair by gratitude. Kessa and Tuvin joined them with the final redesign plans. The surviving bridge could not return to its old centralized system. That was an advantage. They divided narrow span into independent sections. Major power changes required confirmation from both Sarah Reach and Torn Basin. Mechanical load locks limited concentrated vehicle weight. Civilian carriers, maintenance machines, and rescue vehicles could pass. A rapid military column could not. If one side attempted to seize the whole system, the sections would isolate without destroying themselves or sending energy toward the communities. The hidden capacitor chambers would become storm shelters and rescue stations. The old defense corridors would hold repair tools, breathing equipment, and emergency coolant. Kessa pointed to the reduced power capacity. Sarah Reach will complain. Tuvin indicated the slower water flow. Torn Basin will also complain. Nolan leaned over the plans. Balanced dissatisfaction. The foundation of durable engineering. Ivara's mouth curved. You have expanded into governance. I deny the accusation. The new operating team selected Ivara as civilian safety coordinator. The position carried no military command and no power to close the entire bridge. Every important decision required cooperation with engineers from both communities. It was less authority than she had held. It was closer to the future she wanted. Nolan received an offer from the mixed maintenance team. The pay was lower than his Terran contract. The workshop was temporary. The bridge needed months of repair, and every official certification would have to be rebuilt from local approval. He also had a seat on the civilian transport leaving Atreya. He stood at the approach on the evening before the ship's departure, watching workers install the first independent section lock. His ribs still hurt when he laughed, which had made the crew unusually entertaining all day. Ivara joined him. Her right hand had regained slight movement, enough to hold a data slate for short periods. The light bands along her neck remained dim on that side. The transport departs tomorrow, she said. I have been informed. You have not packed. I own one equipment case. Packing lacks suspense. Are you returning to Earth? Nolan looked across narrow rift. Lights from Sarah Reach and Torn Basin now ran along the same power rhythm. Not perfectly. The bridge still required constant correction. No, Ivara did not answer at once. He held up the local maintenance contract. Narrow span needs someone familiar with the new structure. The operating team needs an engineer who did not fight for either side. Also, the bridge has tried to kill me too many times. I cannot leave before teaching it better manners. The bridge may not be the only thing requiring that lesson. Nolan looked at her. Is that an invitation or a warning? Ivara placed 2 access cards on the rail. One was his new work credential. The other opened a room in the maintenance residence. With your field experience, she said, you should know that those sometimes use the same code. He picked up the cards. Her left hand rested on the rail between them. Nolan placed his hand beside it, leaving her the distance to choose. Ivara turned her hand and linked her fingers with his. There was no audience close enough to notice. No promise followed. Neither of them needed one yet. Below, workers called for the next load test. Nolan looked at Ivara. We appear to be needed. We will continue this conversation later. That sounded more like a warning. It was intended as both. They walked onto narrow span together. The first full supply carrier entered the repaired lane as they reached the control station. Its load was divided exactly as the new system required. Kessa confirmed the Sarah Reach section. Tuvin confirmed the Torn Basin section. The mechanical locks opened one at a time. The carrier rolled across metal scarred by war, sabotage, heat, and hurried repair. New plates did not match the old ones. Burn marks remained around the center. The bridge shivered as another wave of solar interference passed through the sky. No one pretended the vibration was gone. The crews measured it, adjusted the load, and kept working. Nolan and Ivara took the next maintenance shift side by side, sharing responsibility for a structure that would never be safe because one person was strong enough to control it. The bridge was never truly finished. Its new metal carried the scars of war, and every storm made it tremble. Yet power crossed in one direction, water flowed in the other, and people who had once seen enemies on the far side now saw workers, patients, families, and neighbors. Nolan and Ivara stayed because they had chosen the same unfinished future. Narrowspan remained standing because people on both sides had learned to carry its weight together. If this story stayed with you, please give the video a like and share it with someone who loves science fiction, adventure, and stories about what can be built after everything seems broken. And if you would like to join us for more journeys beyond Earth, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Thank you for listening. Until our next story, remember that the strongest connections are not the ones that never break. They're the ones we choose to rebuild.